A 1988 John Deere 3155 sat rusted, neglected, and forgotten at a cold Indiana auction. Buyers walked past, calling it worthless junk, but buried deep inside its engine was a secret worth over $16,000. A hidden truth left behind by a former owner, waiting for the one man who still respected honest iron. The price dropped 3 times before anyone even bothered to raise a hand. It was a bitterly cold Thursday morning in March of 2001, and the auctioneer was standing beside a 1988 John Deere 3155 that had been sitting at the far back of a farm dispersal sale in Benton County, Indiana. For over 2 hours, the green machine had gathered nothing more than casual, indifferent glances. It was brought out dead last, well after the combines, the planters, and the newer, shiny row crop tractors had already been sold. That is simply how auctioneers handle the difficult lots, saving them for the end when the serious money has packed up, the crowd is tired, and the few remaining men are just looking to pick up something cheap or go home with empty hands. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his chant echoing over the cold gravel. He opened the bidding at $8,000. Silence. He scanned the weary faces, then dropped the call to $6,000. A man leaning against the fence made a half-hearted offer of $5,000. The auctioneer worked the remaining crowd, trying to squeeze out a competing bid, but no one moved. He dropped to $4,500. Still nothing. $4,000. The man by the fence shook his head, tucked his hands into his canvas coat, and walked toward his truck. $3,200. The auctioneer called out, his voice tinged with impatience. From the back of the small group, a single hand went up. That hand belonged to Daniel Puit, a quiet 38-year-old farmer who worked 360 acres of corn and soybean ground down in Warren County. It was a farm he had been running entirely on his own ever since his wife Carol took a full-time teaching job in Williamsport that kept her in town 5 days a week. Daniel had come to the auction looking for a secondary tillage tractor, a dependable worker to pull his chisel plow and field cultivator without placing unnecessary stress on his main machine. His primary tractor was carrying more hours than he was comfortable with, and he had no backup behind it. Daniel had set a strict budget for the day. He would not spend a penny over $4,000. At $3,200, the John Deere was well under his limit. He raised his palm, the auctioneer pointed sharply into the cold wind, and not another soul moved. Sold. Daniel walked up to the cashier's folding table, pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket, and wrote out the payment. With the receipt in hand, he turned to figure out how to get the green iron back to Warren County. He didn't have to look far. A farmer standing nearby, a man he had bumped into twice at the grain elevator, was already hitching a heavy drop-deck implement trailer behind his heavy-duty pickup. Hearing Daniel's situation, the neighbor gestured toward the ramp with a quick nod, offering to haul the John Deere south since he was heading past Daniel's place anyway. They lined up the ramps, guided the 3155 onto the wooden deck, and secured it tightly with transport chains before heading out on the frost-dusted highway. By late afternoon, the truck backed up to Daniel's drive, and the quiet diesel engine of the Deere clattered to life, just long enough to unload. Daniel backed the machine into the shadow of his steel equipment shed, parked it, and shut it off. Silence settled over the shed, broken only by the sharp tick of cooling steel. Standing back in the dimming light coming through the open barn door, Daniel took his first real, deliberate look at what $3,200 had bought him. The iconic John Deere green paint was heavily faded, worn down to gray primer along the top corners of the hood and side panels where years of sun and weather had done their work. On the left side of the cab, a long diagonal crack ran across the glass, held together by strips of black electrical tape applied from the inside. Looking closer at the rear linkages, he spotted a main hydraulic line wrapped tight in silver duct tape over what had clearly been an old fluid leak. He stepped up into the doorway and checked the instrument cluster. The hour meter read 9,400 hours. The seller, an aging farmer named Howard Kessel who was liquidating his operation after a family crisis, forced a move to the city, had listed the tractor as simply needing work, without offering a single detail. Daniel didn't hold it against him. He had bought equipment needing work before. To an experienced operator, it was an accepted gamble. The price had compensated for the unknown, and Daniel had the tools, the time, and the mechanical knowledge to face whatever was waiting under that faded green hood. Daniel Puitt had grown up around farm equipment the way country children learn most things that matter, by proximity, by necessity, and by the practical education that comes from standing beside a father whose hands were constantly stained with grease and gear oil. His father had worked 600 acres in Fountain County, maintaining every tractor, planter, and combine himself. Out in the rural countryside, relying on a dealership 40 minutes away meant losing precious daylight during harvest, an expense no working farm could afford. By the time Daniel took over his own acreage in 1990, he possessed a specific kind of literacy. He could rebuild a hydraulic pump by memory, diagnose a firing issue from the scent of the exhaust, and read the health of a diesel engine off a dipstick with the calm certainty of someone who had been reading iron since he was 12 years old. He was not a factory-trained technician. He was a working farmer whose knowledge was forged through decades of hands-on experience. On Saturday morning, while the horizon was still a dull gray, Daniel stepped into his machine shed at exactly 6 o'clock. The morning air was crisp and still. He set his heavy steel toolbox on the workbench, laid out a greasy factory service manual, and placed a yellow legal pad with a sharpened pencil beside it. He was ready to begin the careful, systematic inspection that every machine with an unwritten history demanded. He started with the basic fluid checks. Pulling the engine dipstick, he held it up to the overhead work light. The oil was dark, as any working diesel's oil would be, but it felt smooth between his thumb and forefinger, showing no gritty metal fragments or milky signs of coolant contamination. He popped the radiator cap and checked the fluid. The green antifreeze looked clear and fresh, recently topped off. Next, he pulled the plug on the transmission housing to check the hydraulic fluid. To his surprise, the oil running down the gauge was clear and amber, indicating it had been changed within the last year. Everything beneath the grime was visibly old, yet noticeably cleaner than the tractor's weathered exterior suggested. Daniel jotted a few notes on his pad, picked up his flashlight, and prepared to dig deeper into the heart of the machine. Daniel climbed up the tractor steps, opened the cab door, and took his seat behind the wheel. He set the throttle lever just above idle, turned the key to energize the glow plugs, and engaged the starter. The starter spun fast with a firm, sharp energy, and on the second turn of the crankshaft, the 7.6-liter turbocharged John Deere diesel engine roared to life. Cold exhaust cleared the stack with a brief snap, rattling the quiet air of the morning shed. For the first 30 seconds, the motor ran rough, shivering slightly on its rubber mounts as cold fuel hit the cold cylinders. Daniel let it warm up slowly, keeping his hand near the key while his eyes scanned the instrument cluster. The oil pressure gauge needle swung up immediately, climbing into the healthy center section of the dial, while the water temperature slowly began its steady rise. As the engine reached its initial operating temperature, the heavy cold start shake died down, but it did not go away entirely. A subtle, rhythmic miss remained in the idle, a faint hitch in the steady pulse of the six-cylinder firing sequence. To an untrained ear, it sounded like normal diesel noise, but to Daniel, it was a clear signal. It wasn't the heavy metallic knock of a failing bearing or the loose rattle of worn rocker arms. It was a slight fuel irregularity. It hinted at a tired fuel injector nozzle or a minor adjustment needed inside the injection pump. Daniel stepped down from the cab, leaving the engine running, and walked outside to examine the vertical exhaust stack against the morning sunlight. A faint blue tint drifted out with the clear smoke. It was light, not the dense black smoke of a motor drowning in raw fuel, or the thick white haze of burning coolant. He listened closely for 20 minutes, as the tractor idled steadily in the shed. The irregular beat remained constant, showing no signs of worsening under heat. Satisfied that the engine was safe to run, Daniel pulled the throttle back and turned off the ignition. The engine shut down with a solid, clean stop. He grabbed his shop flashlight, unlatched the heavy side panel, and leaned deep into the engine bay, shining his light behind the cylinder block to inspect the fuel delivery lines. Daniel leaned deep into the engine compartment, tracing the high-pressure steel fuel lines with his flashlight beam. As he brought the light down along the back of the injection pump, something caught his eye in the narrow gap between the pump body and the firewall. Tucked tightly into the recessed steel bracket, held in place by the mounting housing itself, was a thick, flat object. Someone had intentionally slid it into the tight space, using the tension of the pump bracket to keep it secured against vibration without crushing it. Daniel reached his fingers into the tight recess, carefully maneuvering the object free. It was a large, heavy paper envelope, yellowed with age, and stained with a dark fringe of diesel residue along the edges, but entirely intact. There was no name written on the front, no address, and no formal markings. Holding the envelope toward the morning light coming through the open shed door, Daniel carefully unfolded the flap. Inside lay 11 sheets of paper. 10 of them were detailed, multi-page computer invoices and parts receipts, bearing the green emblem of Watsika Implement, an authorized John Deere dealership in Covington. The dates on the work orders ranged from April to November of 1997. As Daniel scanned down the line items, his eyes widened slightly. The receipts documented a complete, ground-up engine overhaul, new oversized pistons, new rings, fresh main and rod bearings, a fully reconditioned cylinder head with new valves, 6 brand-new fuel injectors, a rebuilt injection pump, and a factory-new turbocharger. The final total stamped across the bottom receipt read $16,340. The 11th page was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, written in a steady, blocky hand with a blue ballpoint pen. It read, "Whoever gets this tractor, I rebuilt this engine in 1997 because I thought I was going to farm it for another 20 years. I didn't get to. The engine has less than 2,000 hours on it since the rebuild. I didn't tell the auctioneer because I didn't want to get into it. The records are real. The dealer is Watsika Implement in Covington. You can call them and verify. Take care of it. It deserves it." Daniel read the handwritten note twice, lingering on the final sentence. Then he spread the 11 pages across the faded green hood of the John Deere 355, looking at the numbers in silence. On Monday morning, before the fieldwork began, Daniel sat down at his kitchen table with his second cup of coffee and the yellowed receipts spread out in front of him. He picked up the wall phone, dialed the number printed at the top of the Watsika Implement bill, and asked to speak directly with the service department. When the service manager answered, Daniel gave him the serial number stamped into the iron frame of the John Deere 3155. He asked if the shop had any archived record of a full engine rebuild performed on that specific machine back in the autumn of 1997. The manager paused, telling Daniel to hold on while he pulled up the old microfiche and shop logs from the filing room. For 4 long minutes, the line remained quiet except for the muffled hum of the dealership in the background. When the manager finally returned to the phone, his voice was clear and certain. He confirmed that every line item on those papers was accurate and logged in their system. He explained that the job had been a complete, no-expense-spared overhaul commissioned by Howard Kessel. The dealership had brought in genuine OEM John Deere parts, heavy-duty pistons, factory rod bearings, and a fresh turbocharger assembly directly from the distribution center. Furthermore, the entire build had been completed by their senior lead mechanic, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades working exclusively on heavy diesel iron for the company. The manager noted that Howard had paid the full $16,340 invoice across 2 cash payments before trailer hauling the machine back to his property. Daniel thanked the man for his time, placed the receiver back on the hook, and stared quietly out the kitchen window toward his machine shed. The full weight of what had taken place on Thursday morning settled over him. He had driven to an auction in the cold, prepared to spend his hard-earned savings on a tired, risky piece of machinery just to pull a plow. He had raised his hand at $3,200, expecting weeks of uncertain repairs and costly mechanical trouble. Instead, tucked behind an oil-stained pump bracket, sat proof that he had just purchased a $16,000 factory rebuilt Hart, practically untouched, for less than the cost of a modern set of rear drive tires. Daniel picked up the phone again and dialed the school in Williamsport, where Carol taught 5th grade. When she came on the line during her lunch break, he walked her through everything: the engine bay, the yellowed paper tucked behind the injection pump, the $16,340 invoice from Watsika Implement, and his call with the service manager. Carol was quiet for a long moment over the staticky connection. "So you bought a machine with a brand new $16,000 engine in it," she said, her voice filled with quiet disbelief. "For $3,200. "That's about the long and short of it," Daniel replied. "And nobody else at the auction knew?" "Howard Kessel knew," Daniel said slowly, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "He knew what he had. I've been sitting here thinking about why he didn't tell the auctioneer. Howard didn't want that tractor getting bid up by traders or equipment dealers who only saw a profit margin on paper. He wanted it to go to a working farmer, someone who bought it for the right reasons, before they ever knew what was tucked inside. "That's an unusual way to sell a tractor," Carol noted gently. "Howard had an unusual way of respecting his work," Daniel said. To him, it was the highest compliment one farmhand could pay another. Later that evening, after the sun dipped below the tree line, Daniel's neighbor Jim Alcott pulled his pickup into the gravel driveway. Jim had dropped by to ask about a leaking hydraulic fitting on his own machine, but his eyes immediately drifted over to the green John Deere 355 parked inside the shed. Daniel pulled 2 folding chairs into the doorway, set out 2 cans of coffee, and told Jim the whole story from start to finish. Jim listened without interrupting once, his weathered face reflecting the soft yellow overhead light of the shed. When Daniel finished, Jim looked at the faded green hood, shook his head slowly, and chuckled. "You think Kessel really hid those papers on purpose? Just so whoever bought it would have to earn the discovery first?" "I don't think Howard calculated it like a game," Daniel answered, watching the evening breeze move through the lane. "I think he was a man who spent good money to fix a machine right, lost his farm to bad luck, and wanted whoever took her home to treat the iron with the same respect he did." Jim looked at the tractor, then back at Daniel. "And you do?" "I intend to," Daniel said. With the mystery of the engine solved, Daniel turned his attention back to the minor irregularity he had noted during the initial inspection. The faint miss in the idle was a small issue, but leaving any fuel system defect unaddressed on a diesel engine could lead to uneven cylinder wear over time. Guided by his mechanical training, Daniel knew the fuel pump itself was solid, which pointed directly to the injectors. On Tuesday morning, Daniel pulled the fuel lines, unbolted the 6 injector assemblies from the cylinder head, and drove them over to a small, independent diesel equipment shop in nearby Attica. The shop was run by an old-school technician who had spent 40 years calibrating pumps and bench-testing injectors. Daniel handed them over, explained the slight miss in the idle, and waited while the craftsman mounted them to the test stand. The diagnosis came quickly. 5 of the injectors delivered a crisp, perfectly atomized spray pattern at the exact factory pop pressure. The 6th injector, however, had simply drifted slightly out of specification, a common occurrence when a machine sits idle through changing seasons. It was not damaged, cracked, or worn out, just slightly out of calibration. The technician disassembled the nozzle, cleaned the internal needle, adjusted the pressure shim, and retested it until the spray pattern matched the other 5 precisely. The total bill for the labor came to exactly $80. Daniel brought the injectors back to his shop, installed new copper crush washers, and torqued each unit back into the cylinder head to factory specifications. He bled the air out of the fuel lines, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The John Deere 3155 caught immediately. As the engine warmed to operating temperature, the difference was striking. The persistent, subtle hitch in the exhaust rhythm was entirely gone. The 7.6-liter engine settled into a deep, rock-solid idle that hummed smoothly through the floorboards. There was no trace of blue smoke, no hesitation when he throttled up, and no uneven vibration running through the frame. With $80 and an afternoon of precise work, Daniel had restored the engine to the exact running condition its rebuild had intended. By late April of 2001, the rain finally gave way to cold, bright sunlight, leaving the fields of Warren County heavy and thick with moisture. The ground was slow to dry, turning the soil into dense, stubborn clay that tested the frame of every piece of iron dragged across it. It was the kind of spring that squeezed small farming operations, where delaying tillage by even a few days could cost a farmer his best planting window. Daniel hooked the John Deere 3155 up to his 12-foot chisel plow, set the hydraulic draft control, and pulled out into the north 360 field. As the steel shanks dropped deep into the dark dirt, the tractor didn't flinch. The 4-wheel drive pulled cleanly through the wet, poorly drained low spots, where the soil stayed soft and heavy long after the ridge tops had dried. Under the heavy strain, the rebuilt 6-cylinder diesel settled into a deep, steady roar. The engine produced a smooth surge of torque, holding its RPM line without lugging down or throwing a single streak of black smoke into the open Indiana sky. Day after day, Daniel spent 12 hours in the cab, turning black dirt into smooth seedbeds. The machine ran with effortless consistency, handling the heavy draft work without a hint of overheating or oil loss. By taking on the demanding initial tillage, the 3155 pulled the heaviest workload off Daniel's primary row crop tractor. It allowed his main machine to remain parked and preserved, saving crucial operational hours and avoiding unnecessary wear on a primary unit that had no safety net behind it. When the last acre of tillage was finished, Daniel realized he was 5 full days ahead of his original spring schedule. In the unpredictable landscape of Midwest farming, 5 extra days meant getting seed into the ground before the next heavy rain system rolled in from the west. Strictly speaking, on paper, an $80 injector calibration and a $3,200 purchase price against 5 recovered planting days did not reduce to a simple mathematical formula. But in the real world of working agriculture, where the right machine pays for itself by quietly doing the job it was bought to do, without breakdown, downtime, or fuss, the old green John Deere had earned its keep before the first corn sprouts ever broke through the soil. Daniel carefully folded Howard Kessel's yellowed note alongside the 11 pages of dealership receipts and carried them into his farm office. He placed the papers inside a clean manila folder, marked it with the tractor's serial number, and filed it neatly in the steel cabinet beside his tax records. Opposite Howard's records, Daniel opened a fresh spiral notebook. On the first page, he wrote the date, the hour meter reading of 9,400, and his first entry, injector recalibration and fresh filters. It was the beginning of a second chapter in the machine's life, documented with the steady discipline of a man who believed that taking care of iron was a moral obligation. As the years rolled on, Daniel's operation grew. In 2004, when an 80-acre parcel of prime ground adjacent to his north boundary came up for sale, Daniel expanded his farm to 440 acres. The John Deere 355 met every new demand without complaint. It pulled field cultivators in the wet spring weather, ran grain augers during the hot autumn harvest, and cleared deep snowdrifts from the farm lane in the dead of winter. Daniel maintained the machine with uncompromising precision. He changed the engine oil every 100 hours without fail, swapped out fuel filters on schedule, and serviced the transmission fluid precisely when the manual demanded it. He deferred nothing. In the summer of 2007, Daniel finally tackled the rear hydraulic hose that had been wrapped in silver duct tape since the day he bought the tractor. Unwinding the old tape, he discovered a tiny outer sheath nick that a previous temporary repair had held together for years. He unbolted the line, walked into the supply store in town, and bought a heavy-duty factory replacement hose for $42. In his logbook, he noted the repair. Replaced original patched line. $42. There was a quiet, practical pride in crossing off that final cosmetic flaw. Each entry in Daniel's logbook mirrored the entries Howard had kept years before. A continuous record of 2 different men, separated by time and circumstance, who shared the exact same fundamental respect for a piece of honest machinery. In the winter of 2009, 8 years after the cold March auction in Benton County, Daniel traveled southeast to Indianapolis to attend the annual Midwest Agricultural Exposition. It was a large, noisy convention filled with rows of gleaming new equipment, digital farm management displays, and hundreds of growers discussing crop yields and fuel prices over styrofoam cups of coffee. Daniel walked the floor, listening to seminars on soil health and farm transitions, enjoying a rare couple of days away from the daily grind of winter farm chores. Scanning the schedule for the afternoon panel discussions, a familiar name printed in the paper program stopped him in his tracks. Howard Kessel, retired operator, former owner of Kessel Farms, Benton County. He was set to speak on a 4-person panel addressing the practical realities of passing down family farmland and liquidating assets. Daniel took a seat in the back row of the conference hall and waited. When the speakers walked out onto the raised stage, Daniel recognized Howard immediately from the auction block years ago. Howard was 73 now. His shoulders were slightly rounded, his white hair was neatly combed, and he moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a man whose joints carried the hard memories of decades spent on cold steel seats and concrete shop floors. Yet his eyes remained sharp, and his voice was clear and steady as he spoke to the crowd about the weight of letting go of an operation built over a lifetime. When the panel concluded, and the room began to clear, Daniel waited quietly near the side of the stage. He watched as a few attendees asked brief questions before wandering off toward the display hall. Once Howard stepped down from the platform, Daniel walked up, extended his hand, and spoke with calm respect. "Mr. Kessel, my name is Daniel Pewitt." Howard looked at him for a moment, scanning Daniel's face with a quiet, inquiring look. Daniel added gently, "I'm the man who bought your green 3155 back in March of 2001. A slow, knowing smile broke across Howard's weathered face. The older man took Daniel's hand, offering a firm, dry grip. "The 3155, Howard said softly, his tone laced with immediate recognition. Daniel nodded. "I found the yellow envelope behind the injection pump bracket." Howard stood quietly in the busy hall, looking at Daniel with a calm, thoughtful expression. "How is she running?" Howard asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. 8 years, Daniel replied, "and she hasn't missed a single day of work. I've put over 5,000 hours on that rebuilt engine since I brought her home to Warren County. She runs just as clean today as she did the day your dealer in Covington buttoned her up." Howard nodded slowly, a look of deep satisfaction settling over his eyes. "I'll tell you something," Howard said, leaning in slightly. "When everything fell apart and I had to sell the place, I didn't know what to do with those service records. If I had handed them over to the auctioneer, he would have shouted it through the speaker. The price would have shot up, and some guy with deep pockets would have bought it just to turn around and flip it for a profit on paper. I didn't want that." "You wanted it to go to a farmer," Daniel said softly. "I wanted it to go to the last man standing," Howard corrected gently. "The fellow who raised his hand when the price was dropped down to the very bottom. A man who looked at a dirty, faded tractor with a cracked window and taped hoses, and saw an honest machine worth taking a chance on at $3,200. Someone who saw its value as a tool before he ever knew what was under the hood. That's the only kind of man who was ever going to take proper care of her." Daniel thought about the cold morning in Benton County, remembering how he had raised his hand from the back of the crowd simply because he needed a dependable tractor to work his ground. "I still have the yellowed envelope in my office cabinet," Daniel said. "The handwritten note too. If you ever want those original papers back for your own family records, I can send them to you." Howard smiled, patted Daniel on the shoulder, and shook his head firmly. "No," Howard said, his voice quiet and sure. "You earned those papers the moment you raised your hand in the cold. You keep them with the tractor. She belongs with you." It was past midnight by the time Daniel pulled his truck into the gravel drive of his Warren County farm. The long drive back from Indianapolis had been quiet, the dark highway stretching out through endless miles of sleeping cornfields. The rest of the house was dark, but Daniel didn't go inside just yet. Instead, he walked across the cold yard, unlatched the side door of the machine shed, and stepped into the quiet darkness within. The air inside smelled familiar, a mix of dry earth, clean hydraulic fluid, and aged steel. He flipped the light switch, illuminating the space in a soft overhead glow. There sat the John Deere 3155, parked in its steady, customary spot beside the tillage tools. Daniel climbed into the cab, turned the key, and brought the 6-cylinder diesel to life. The starter spun, the motor caught instantly, and the 7.6-liter engine settled into its familiar, rock-solid idle. Daniel didn't turn on the working lights or adjust the throttle. He simply sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the deep, steady rhythm of the motor that Howard Kessel had rebuilt 12 years prior, and that he himself had maintained with unyielding discipline ever since. He stepped down from the cab and walked around to the side of the idling machine. The engine hummed smoothly, sending a gentle, continuous vibration through the frame and out into the concrete floor. Daniel reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the green metal of the hood, right above the cylinder head. The steel was warm to the touch, radiant with the steady heat of clean combustion. Standing alone in the midnight quiet of the shed, he held his hand there for a long moment, feeling the quiet pulse of the mechanical heart beneath the paint. It was an unspoken gesture, a quiet exchange of respect between a man and a tool that had never failed him. There was no need for grand words or formal speeches out here in the shed. The iron had carried its weight across 2 decades and 2 owners, proving its worth not through promises, but through thousands of hours of honest, unbroken work in the Indiana dirt. Satisfied, Daniel reached through the cab door, pulled the shutoff cable, and listened as the engine coasted to a smooth, silent stop. The years moved with the steady rhythm of the seasons across Warren County. By the spring of 2024, Daniel was 61 years old. The dark hair at his temples had turned entirely silver, and his hands bore the thick, calloused lines of over 3 decades spent turning dirt and pulling wrenches. The farm had grown into a fully established, highly efficient operation, but Daniel no longer ran it alone. His 26-year-old son, Matthew, had returned home after finishing his agricultural degree, stepping seamlessly into the daily work of the family land. On a crisp April afternoon, the main shed was quiet, except for the distinct sound of a socket wrench clicking against steel. Matthew was crouched beside the John Deere 3155, performing the pre-season spring maintenance. The tractor, now 36 years old, still wore its original green paint, faded slightly from decades of sun, but clean, straight, and entirely free of rust. Matthew was installing a fresh set of fuel filters, wiping down the lines with meticulous care before torquing the housings down. "She's sitting right at 15,000 hours, Dad," Matthew called out, leaning back to check the seal. "Runs like she came off the showroom floor yesterday." Daniel smiled, leaning against the doorway of the farm office with a cup of black coffee in hand. "That's because every hour put on that block was earned, Matt. You treat the machine right, and it returns the favor." Later that afternoon, while Daniel was out taking delivery of seed bags, Matthew stepped into the office to file the receipt for the new filters. He opened the top drawer of the steel cabinet and pulled out the manila folder labeled with the 3155 serial number. Inside, resting alongside 23 years of Daniel's own detailed service entries, was Howard Kessel's original yellowed note from 1997. Matthew pulled the note out and read the clear, precise handwriting, detailing the secret engine overhaul and the quiet instruction left for the next operator. Standing there in the quiet office, the young man understood. The tractor was not just a collection of steel, gears, and hydraulic fluid bought at a discount. It was a bridge of trust passed down through honest hands. Matthew carefully folded the note back into its sleeve, placed the filter receipt on top, and closed the drawer. Out in the shed, he picked up his grease gun, walked back to the green hood, and went to work with a renewed sense of pride. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the western horizon and cast long shadows across the concrete apron of the shop, Matthew walked up to his father. He held the manila folder lightly in his hand. "Dad," Matthew asked, looking out toward the field where the John Deere 355 stood hitched and ready for tomorrow's groundwork, "when you found Howard's note back in 2001, did knowing about that $16,000 rebuild change everything for you?" Daniel took a slow breath, looking at the faded green paint reflecting the amber sunset. He shook his head gently. "No, Matt," Daniel replied smoothly. "It didn't change a single thing about how I treated that machine. I bought her because I needed an honest tractor to work this ground, and I was going to care for her properly whether she had a worn-out engine or a brand new one. Finding Howard's note didn't change my duty. It just proved that 2 decisions made in good faith were right from the start. Howard made the quiet decision to protect a good machine and leave it for a real operator. And I made the decision to raise my hand when no one else would, promising to respect the iron." Matthew looked down at the old note, then back at his father, nodding slowly as the deeper truth settled in. The true value of a machine never lay in a discounted auction price or a hidden receipt tucked behind a pump. It lived in the quiet integrity of the men who worked the wrenches and held the steering wheel. Today, 36 years after it rolled off the assembly line, the John Deere 3155 still heads out into the Warren County dirt every single spring. Its engine hums with the same deep, steady roar, turning Indiana soil line after line, acre after acre, a living testament to hard work, honest care, and a heritage that never goes out of style. If you appreciate the quiet power of classic iron, the history behind legendary machines, and the timeless values of rural life, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your voice. Leave a comment below and share the story of the tractor or machine on your farm that never gave up.